We'd like to thank Mainspring Companies for sponsoring Season 1 of The Next Entrepreneur. Mainspring celebrates the entrepreneurial journey, and we are very grateful for their support.
I eventually drove down to the main branch for Pelican Homestead on Airline Highway in Metairie, or New Orleans, Metairie, off of Airline Highway. And they actually kicked me out of their office. Said the numbers I was proposing were too low. And so the last thing I said as I was leaving his office is, I said, well, sir, I have cash and I will pay in cash. If you change your mind, please give me a call. And they called me back about 10 days later, and we agreed on a price. And at that point, I celebrated for about 30 seconds, and I said, oh, my God, where am I going to go get $400,000 in cash?
I'm Andrew McClendon, your host of the Next Entrepreneur podcast, and we are here today with our producer, Daniel Sagona, and our guest, Darryl Smith. Darryl, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so Darryl and I are good friends, and
Yes.
we have been for a good long while. And we first met when I was introduced to you by an architect, and to you as a potential client that I might build for, and me as a contractor. And that deal never did happen for us. I think you ended up doing something with that. But that started our relationship. And what's interesting about that is a lot of times, a business owner can build a relationship with their clients, in this case, a contractor with his client. But I've never worked for you. I've never done a project, but we have become, I consider you a great friend. And I love that. I love that story that, that I met you through business, but ultimately didn't really do any business. But here we are now, great friends. And I'm glad that you're on the show. So thank you for never hiring me.
Well, let me correct one moment. For a moment, let me correct something. You say we never worked together as a client, but in fact, you helped me a lot more than you realize by questions and answers and projects that you looked at, and just feeding off of your comments.
Yeah, we've remained very engaged, and I always love our time together. And you've had me look at several things over the years, and I love to consult with you on those and share any insight that I have. But I love our relationship. I value our relationship, and you've been incredibly successful, and that's why you're here, because I would like to see if our listeners and viewers can pick up on some little gems through your success over the decades. And but I did kind of want to start with what your early years looked like. You were a West Baton Rouge guy growing up, right?
Yes, grew up in West Baton Rouge Parish on a farm in a small farming community named Bush, Louisiana.
Oh yeah.
And it's my grandfather's place where I grew up in the middle of cotton fields and cattle, pecan trees, and the most striking point of that operation was he had close to 100 rent houses, which really gave me a foundation to relate to as I got older.
Now, were those houses on the property or just in the surrounding area?
No, they were on the property. He built them on the perimeter of his acreage. So all his backyards either had cattle fields or cotton fields.
So it sounds like he milked the every square foot of that real estate in between cotton, cattle, and and rental property.
Yes. We had a cotton gin as well. So he was a very industrial man, and he used every inch of his property to generate revenue.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
And a country store. We had a Bush's Country Store, which was on Bush Road. A lot of people would go through to get to new roads. They would take the Bush Road and stop at our country store to gas up and buy supplies, drinks, and food.
So he's in retail too.
Yes, he was. Yes, and he also had a restaurant on False River called Triple Arch. So I had a lot of things, moving parts that I saw as a child growing up in a very diverse environment.
Now, did they do any pecan farming or?
Yes, we had a section of our property, maybe 600 acres, that were dedicated to pecan orchards.
That's huge.
So we had that was called Arbroath, where we had pecan and cattle. And then on Rose Hill, we had cotton and cattle.
That's fascinating.
And then we also had the pasture land, where you really just let your cattle graze. But
Right.
In the summertime, us boys would go swimming in the Mississippi River.
So that's the land on the river side of the levee,
Correct.
and which at times would be underwater, maybe.
Yes, absolutely. So you couldn't use it for anything other than
Right.
for your cattle to graze on the levee, and maybe cut some timber, do some clear cutting.
Yeah. And later years, oil on that property, or?
Yes, in the 70s when they had the oil embargo with Saudi Arabia, OPEC. Of course, Louisiana exploded with oil and gas finds and drilling, and we prospered from that as well.
Yeah. So that is fascinating. How many uses and how many different types of businesses your grandfather was. Yeah, that's just fascinating. I can see where your entrepreneurial drive was rooted early.
Yes, it was. When you think about it, he had approximately 3,000 acres, maybe 3,500. And in that acreage, in those tracts of land, he had cattle, cotton, pecan, rent houses, and oil and gas.
Unbelievable.
So he was blessed.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like he worked hard too.
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
Yes, he did.
So, and then you spent your high school years, you actually went to school in Baton Rouge, right?
Yes. Well, we would travel from Bush, Louisiana. We would travel to Baton Rouge. So I went to elementary school at St. Anthony, and then from there I went to Redemptorist.
And graduated from Redemptorist.
Graduated from Redemptorist in 1980.
1980. And a ball player.
I played on the football team, was a quarterback.
Yeah. I've heard a few stories over the years that we've shared, and that was fun. So college years.
College years, I went to Hines Junior College on a quarterback, on a scholarship to play football. Played there 1 year, went to LSU, had too much fun, and ended up at Hammond, where I settled down and graduated.
SLU. In Hammond. And so tell us about, it was during your college years and from stories past that you've shared with me, that's where you started to get some experience in the business that you ended up in, which was initially multifamily housing. So give us an idea of what your initial experience was with that.
Well, my story began really when I was at LSU. I got a summer job working for Linda and Jack Dyer, who had a home off of O'Neill Lane. And so I worked there that summer, and I went to Miss Dyer and I said, well, Miss Dyer, I'm going to have to quit because I've decided to transfer to Southeastern. finished my college career there. And Miss Dyer at the time said, well, Darryl, I own an apartment complex across the street from the college. And at that moment, she walked over to the phone, picked up the phone, called and said, Darryl Smith is going to manage my property in Hammond, make the arrangements. And that's how I started in the multifamily housing.
Now, was Jack an engineer?
Jack Dyer, to my knowledge, owned a large portfolio of commercial and multifamily housing in Louisiana and Texas.
I see. So
his father was a boxer at LSU.
Oh, really?
Back in, I guess, the 40s or 50s.
So you're working for the Dyers. You're managing an apartment, and which means what? You get room and board, or
Miss Dyer paid me $200 a month to manage the Brent apartments at the time, and so I'd go to school, manage those, kept them full, and but also worked on Saturdays and Sundays at her house. So that's where my life changed, because I found myself working 7 days a week, and from that point on, I haven't really changed that habit.
Yeah, well, so you do that. So is that what your college career jobs look like? I
did that until I graduated, and in those years, the economy collapsed in the early 1980s,
right?
And the banks foreclosed on that particular complex in Hammond, and as well as a number of properties around the campus. And I graduated in '87. And within a month of me graduating, I had acquired under contract the Brent Apartments.
And so those are the years, correct me if I'm wrong, where the Resolution Trust Corporation, RTC, was formed by the U.S. government to help liquidate properties that banks had taken back in foreclosure, right? I mean, there was such a massive meltdown in the economy that the banks were just overloaded. Help us understand what RTC did, and then the role that it played. Was it involved in that first project you acquired?
No, not at that time, but the Resolution Trust Corporation, RTC, their mission was to close down non-performing banks that were in trouble. And they did it very aggressively, and banks were trying to survive. So any properties that they had on their books, they were trying to find any buyers that were credit worthy that would take them off their hands. So as a lot of people will remember, back in those days, you could make some really good buys. So at that time, I bought my first property in '87, and the RTC, there was a window of probably about 4 to 5 years where the RTC was very active in liquidating banks and in the inventory.
There were deals to be had.
There were deals. I bought some properties for $1,000 a unit, $1,500 a unit, $5,000 a unit, $10,000 a unit, 12.
So walk us through what that first deal. I mean, you graduated from college. I heard you say within a month.
Yes.
You're putting in a contract. So walk us through, like, what is a brand new college grad would look like, and how is a bank involved? What did that look like?
Well, by the time I graduated, I was working also managing one of the apartment complexes and also working for a family, the Gewalt family of Hammond. They were based out of La Jolla, San Diego, California. And I worked for them for several years, maybe a total of about 7 years. So when I graduated, I had already had 2 years under my belt with the Gewalt family and managing another apartment complex and of course going to college. So and all of a sudden I was 25 years old, and I had all this experience in management, school, and working for the Gewalt family in accounts payable, accounts receivables. They were a large landowner in Tangipahoa Parish. And other than that, I was completely lost as far as buying, because I really had never purchased anything of substance. So Charles Gewalt, one of the Gewalt brothers, had made a comment to me. There was the first deal I found. I presented it to them to buy, and they turned it down, and they said, "Well, Darryl, we want you to go and buy it." Charles and John Gewalt. My comment to them was, "Well, I have no money. I have $200, maybe $300 in my pocket." And Charles looked at me and said, "Well, Darryl, you don't need to have money to buy real estate," which was a complete mystery to me for him to make that statement. But he said, "The key to being successful in real estate is buying things at the right price." And so I took that piece of advice and slept on it. And the next day I called the realtor who was handling it, which was Mr. Durnan. I believe his name is Durham, Mr. Durham.
Yeah.
Forget his first name. And he had an office in City Plaza in downtown Baton Rouge, across from the Baton Rouge City Club.
Right.
And so I called him, had an appointment, went down and saw him, and made an offer, a really low offer. He laughed and told me that would never fly. And I said, "Well, just present it to them." So he presented it to then Pelican Homestead, and we went back and forth. And I eventually drove down to the main branch for Pelican Homestead on Airline Highway in Metairie, or New Orleans Metairie, off of Airline Highway. And they actually kicked me out of their office. Said the numbers I was proposing were too low. And so the last thing I said as I was leaving his office is, I said, "Well, sir, I have cash, and I will pay in cash. If you change your mind, please give me a call." And they called me back about 10 days later, and we agreed on a price. And at that point, I celebrated for about 30 seconds, and I said, "Oh my God, where am I going to go get $400,000 in cash?" But the deal was so good, it was so attractive that I found a local bank in Hammond to finance it. And that's where my career started.
So property in Hammond, and how many units was that?
42 rental units.
42. And so that was a start. And so the bank in Hammond, how does a bank lend a young college grad kid that kind of money?
Well, when I told them the price, they couldn't believe that I had acquired or a contract for that location, which is right across the street from the college, for $10,000, right at $10,000 a unit. They even sent one of their vice presidents over to inspect the complex with me. The next day we had a meeting, and they said, "Well, we can't find anything wrong with the property." And I said, "Well, I told you, it's just a great deal. It's just a great price." And they brought it to their board, and their board was shocked that Pelican was selling the building at such a low price. But in those days, you could do that without having any net worth. You know, they looked at individual deals. Today, you have to have wealth to go with acquisitions of that nature. So.
Yeah, so they were strictly looking at the collateral.
That's it. It was a collateral purchase, and great location, great value. The value was probably worth at least $1.2 million, and so they had close to $800,000 in equity.
So your first deal is inked, and you're in business. And
interest rate was 13.5%. 20-year amortization. But the numbers worked, and that was the first time I really I think I went from making maybe 5 to 7 thousand a year. I probably started making 40 or 50,000 a year at that time.
Yeah, that's a pretty serious upgrade.
Mm-hmm.
And so, at what point did you realize I'm like, this is my direction. This is what I'm going to do.
Well, it became apparent at the closing when I signed the document. My attorney at the time looked to me and said, "Well, Darryl, you just made your first $1 million." And to myself, I said, "Well, this is so easy. This is too easy." And but I enjoyed the art of the deal,
So you had looked at he had looked at the appraised value and versus
Yes.
what you had paid, and so that must have been pretty intoxicating to hear that.
Well, I discarded it. I value. I try to concentrate on cash flows. That's always been my motto. Is you got to make sure cash flows. Great location, cash flows. And if you can do that and put in the years of work, you'll be fine.
Yeah. And so, how long was it before you approached purchasing your next property?
Well, let me say this. One of the things the Gewalt family told me, Darryl, you did good on your first buy. That was really impressive. But we want you to get ready because people are going to call you and start wanting to take you to lunch. And they're going to take you to play golf. And they're going to invite you to football games and basketball games. And of course, I'm 25 years old. And I've never had anybody call me and say, other than my father and mother and father, "Let's go eat." And I said, "I can't believe that." "Oh, they do that, Darryl. They do that." So to my surprise, my phone started ringing and bankers started calling me. People started offering other deals to me. And it grew. And I always, my approach was back in those days, I looked at everything and based it on cash flow and nothing more.
Yeah.
And I was able to beat down the prices because of the economy was in bad shape. But most of these assets, when banks own it, they're always mismanaged. They're all constantly. Operating expenses are too high. And I saw that at that age, at 25. I said, these guys are paying an exorbitant amount of money to maintain these assets. So I always came in with cash offers. And that's how I did it.
Yeah, that is cool. Okay, let's take a quick break right here, Darryl, get in a word from our sponsor, and we'll be right back. MBD Maintenance is a proud sponsor for the Next Entrepreneur podcast, and we greatly appreciate their support. MBD Maintenance is a commercial building and maintenance contractor. They will build your commercial building, maintain it. They do additions, remodeling, tenant improvements. If you need MBD Maintenance for your commercial building needs, you can find them online at mbdmaintenance.com. Okay, we are back with Darryl Smith. So, Darryl, your company is Smith Properties.
Well, I have the management company is SPM. I've taken my name out of that equation, and but I have a number of LLCs for all the assets that I have.
So kind of a holding company and then LLCs underneath that for each individual property,
yes.
right?
Yeah.
And so, so you started getting calls, and people are thinking, "Hey, here we have found a potential buyer."
Yes.
And so, how long was it before your second deal? Would you guess?
Oh, I'd say within 18 months.
Yeah.
I started. I said, "Well, I think I figured out how to operate this thing." I got in and got rid of all the fat and streamlined it and was 100% full. And then
Let me ask you. So, to what degree is your sweat equity working? Are you painting units as a young guy? Are you fixing things, or how are you approaching that?
well, at that point, I was, of course, mowing the grass, trimming the bushes. I did 95% of all the work. So I cleaned the apartments when people would move out. I would paint, and I quickly learned that took up a lot of energy and a lot of time.
Yeah.
And after cleaning 20 or 30 stoves, I said, I don't want to do this anymore. I like the art of the deal.
Yeah.
So I started something new that was not being done at the time in Hammond. I wasn't aware of it in Baton Rouge, but I started charging people a cleaning fee. Because in those days, you would move into an apartment and it was as is. So you wouldn't, people didn't automatically paint and clean your apartments. You would hold the deposit and somebody moves out and you said, well, look, if you don't do this, this, and this, we're going to subtract from your deposit. Well, there's always a lot of heated discussions on,
right,
I left it cleaner than I got it, that type of approach. And so I said, I want to eliminate all that. I'm just going to charge you $50 when you move out. And that's going to go toward me hiring someone to clean the apartments.
Right.
And I got out of the cleaning business real quick.
Yeah.
And so that's how I freed up a lot more of my time, and I began to manage things through fees, cleaning fees, trash fees, anything of that nature.
So that freed you up some time to do more deals. And so walk us through how your business began to grow after that first 18 months when you got into your second property and beyond. What did that trajectory look like?
Well, the first thing was when I bought it, I closed on it, I believe, in August. And by the time I closed on it, I had the property 100% full going into the fall semester. And then October 19th occurred, the great stock market meltdown. So here I am sitting in the living room, and I just signed a note for $400,000. And the stock market collapsed. And the state of Louisiana is under a lot of stress and things of that nature. And I'm saying, my Lord, what in the world have I done? But I realized that the sun's still shining, the wind's still blowing. Everything's seems to be normal course of business, even though the stock market just lost, 50 or 60% of their value. So going through that trauma, that stress really prepared me for the next 33 years. So, but after that, I just spent more and more of my time writing, and I came up with the idea that it would be really neat if you could acquire the majority of the housing that surrounds the campus of Southeastern. So I spent most of my time just writing, and then I started making offers, and I started buying more and more of the complexes and the raw land that surrounded the campus.
And so when you started, what would you guesstimate the enrollment at SLU was?
Well, the enrollment was 5,000. And the turning point was when LSU announced that they would no longer have open admissions. And I'm sitting on my couch and I'm watching the news, and they made that announcement that LSU's no longer going to take everybody who wants to go there.
Right.
And it dawned on me, and I said, well, this is that golden opportunity. I have to move fast. Because if they can't go to LSU, they're either going to go to Lafayette or they're going to go to Hammond.
Right.
That was my mindset.
Right.
They're going to stay on that I-10, I-12 corridor.
Right.
And I so aggressively went out and tied up every complex I could. So anything that was on the market, I got it under contract. And I started then playing with the numbers. All right, well, if I have 400 units, or if I have 200 units, or if I have 600, the economies of scale will take over. And then I aggressively got under contract to all the raw land, all within 2 city blocks of the campus. And that's always been my formula. I never went beyond 2 blocks for student housing. And so any raw land, any houses, any apartment complexes I bought. And it was a gamble because I figured the enrollment would go from 5,000 to maybe 6 or 7, but I was wrong. It went from 5,000 to 10 and 15, and I think it reached at one time 17 or 18,000 students. Right. And with that, the debt stayed the same and reduced every year, but the rents exploded. So rental rates went from $175, $200 a month to $400 to $500 to $600 to $700 for a one-bedroom apartment. And the 2 bedrooms, did the same, $200 to $400, $600, $800, $1,000, $1,100, $1,200, $1,300. Wow. And that's where I had a tremendous amount of cash flow.
And so it's all about seizing that opportunity, but there was a gamble.
Yes.
Right. But it sounds like you said, look, I got to get here first. This is my territory. I want to own it. And you did.
Yes.
And that gamble paid off for you. So, so you were really had this singular focus on student housing, right?
Right.
Around the university in Hammond. And so for how many years would you guess you focused almost exclusively on that before you ventured out into other types of real estate?
Well, I focused on that because I wanted to eliminate as much competition from out of town investors.
Right.
So once I had all that tied up, then I concentrated on rehab, renovations, and the construction. I opened up a little construction company, so we specialized in rehabbing. But it was 1999 when I ventured outside of multifamily housing, and again that was primarily due to the fact that my cash flows were so strong. I had cash to support acquisitions and land. So I started buying land up around the country club. And then my goal then was I'll buy everything I can around the Oakno Country Club, raw land. Yeah. And I developed subdivisions around the country club, gated communities. And that was a success. So I then took, I was just at that point where I had a lot of equity, a lot of cash flow. And I took the lot sales, and I always paid off the banks first. I would pay myself I usually gave them 100% of the proceeds. So I ended up with 70% of my project paid off with no debt. And so then I started looking at other income-producing assets other than raw land.
Yeah. So on the gated residential developments, were you developing lots and selling lots to builders, or were you going vertical with the houses?
No. I was developing and selling the lots to homeowners, and they would hire the builders.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So I did three subdivisions, and and then Katrina hit, and I said, never again am I going to build homes where I had to spend so much time building a custom home for a family. It was just too much stress.
So you did dabble in it, but you said,
no, not for me.
That's for others.
That's for other people to do. So I just concentrated at that point selling lots, and then I ventured off into by I guess maybe 06, 05, 06, 07. I started buying properties around the hospital, North Oaks Hospital, and strip centers.
The like medical office buildings.
Yeah, medical space.
So you always keeping a focus on your initial project of the multifamily around the
Yes.
university, and then you went to you added residential lot development, and then you're getting into medical facilities around the hospital, and then retail on top of that as well.
Yeah, retail came last, and I bought a few centers, strip centers, open air strip centers, small centers, 30,000 to 50,000 square feet. And
So at this point, Darryl, what year would you say we're at now by the time you're into the retail stuff?
I would say that's probably in 08. Yeah, 2008,
So
2010.
at that point, is almost everything exclusively in the Hammond market?
At that point, yes, I'd say most of the stuff was in Hammond. I did a couple of deals in St. Tammany Parish,
Right.
and but I hadn't gone to Baton Rouge yet. I hadn't come back home and done anything
Yeah.
in the Baton Rouge. That came, I think, in 2014, 2015. I said it's time for me to get out of Hammond.
So it was then. I was going to ask you, at what point did you decide to go beyond the Tangipahoa and St. Tammany markets? And it was around 14, 15.
I would say so, yes.
And so when you look at getting out of the markets, walk us through, what kind of properties you were looking at, and was there a grand plan of diversification in markets, or had you exhausted all decent deals in Hammond area, or what was your mindset there?
Well, probably at that time, I just had a desire to get outside of Tangipahoa Parish.
Yeah.
Keep what I have, manage it, my home base. But I wanted to go somewhere else.
Yeah, I mean, you'd spent a lot of time in that market,
Yeah.
and you kind of wore those roads out.
Well, I looked around and I didn't feel like there were any great opportunities any longer. I had did the things that I wanted to do at that time, diversified, and I always wanted to be a well-diversified operation. And then I found I said, well, let me go look outside of Hammond, and found a project in Baton Rouge that's turned out well, and then from there I found some deals in Shreveport and Alexandria. Passed on Shreveport, acquired something in Alexandria that's worked out well. And then I went off to Mobile to spend the weekend in 2017, and I found a beautiful 18-story building. And I just fell in love with it, and I called the owner, and we spoke. And it's a funny story, but this gentleman out of New York and I are talking, and he says, well,
The guy in New York owned the building?
Yes.
You're talking about the old Waterman building in downtown Mobile, right?
Yeah, Waterman Steamship Corporation built this 18-story building in 1947. They were the third largest shipping company in the world at that time. And they built this beautiful Art Deco building in downtown.
Now, I went to go look at that building with you.
Yes.
And it is beautiful. And tell me if I'm remembering this correctly. The mechanical system in that building was dated from the original construction, but did part of that come out of a ship or something? What was that?
Well, it's remarkable, but the engine room was designed by the shipping company. So they had their engineers and their mechanical engineers, industrial part of their operation design the
mechanical system,
HVAC system, the ballers, and in that building. They have two of each. They have two ballers and two chillers and two domestic pumps, everything comes in twos. And
So it was the design logic that they would find in some of their ships. They apply to this.
absolutely, yeah. It's they've told me several times that this engine room is designed after one of their large boats that traveled around the world.
And it's an 18-story office building.
It's an 18-story.
And that was their headquarters.
That was their headquarters. It's a beautiful building. It has a terrace on the 16th floor.
Yeah.
And that's what caught my eye.
Yeah. I was on there.
I was. We stayed at the Battle House with my two sons, Robert and Alan, and we got a little burger at Bob's Burger in Mobile. Walked out. I look up and I said, "Boys, look at how beautiful that building is. We have to go see that building." And of course, Robert says, "No, I want to go swimming. Let's go to the hotel. I want to go swimming, Daddy." I said, "We'll do that, but let's walk over and look at this building first." And I walk up. I look in the window, and they have murals drawn all over the walls on the first floor from the the art director. LSU art director drew those murals in 1947
on the walls of the first floor lobby.
Yes, it was their main lobby into the main Waterman,
which are still there. Oh, well, that's what you were looking at, right?
Yes, still there in mint condition, and we protected very closely.
Well, look, I think I interrupted you when you were starting to tell the story of talking to the owner in New York. And
so, right about that time, when I looked at the building with the boys, I saw a leasing sign. And I look at Robert and I said, "Robert, I'd like to buy this building." And he looks at me, rolls his eyes and said, "Daddy." So I call the number, and agent answers the phone call, and I said, "Ma'am, by chance is this building for sale?" So she says, "Well, yes, it is." And I said, "Well, I want to write a contract right now." And she says, "Well, I'm sorry, but I'm on vacation at Gulf Shores, and I'm not going to drive in to Mobile to write a contract." I said, "Well, why don't you just write it up and fax it to me or scan it to me or send me a contract off your computer, your laptop. It's 2017. Surely you have that technology." And she says, "No, I'm not going to do that. I'll be there in a week." I said, "Yes, ma'am." "Okay, yes, ma'am." So we hung up the phone. I called the agent back in Covington. I said, "Write this contract up right now and send it to this lady. And also make a requirement. I want to speak to the owner." And it turns out to be a gentleman out of New York. And so we arranged it. A few days later, we speak. And Mr. Arthur Kornfeld, very nice young man, older gentleman.
Right.
And Arthur tells me, he says, "Well, Mr. Smith, I have a number of people who want to buy this building. Why should I pick you?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to tell you a story. Don't be offended, please, if there are any ladies on the phone," because it was a conference call. I think they had 4 or 5 people on the phone call. I said, "Ladies, please forgive me if I offend you." But I walked out of Bob's Burger. I looked up to my left, and I saw this beautiful building with a terrace, and it simply reminded me of a beautiful, tall, good-looking woman. And he just busted out laughing on the phone. And I said, I'm thinking to myself, I hope I didn't insult anybody.
Did I just blow this deal?
I just blew this deal. But I said, "Well, I'm just going to be honest with you, Frank." And he says, then he called me by my first name, Darryl. "That was the best answer. And we'll pick you. And we'll work with you to sell this building too." He says, "That's a one-of-a-kind answer. I've never heard that type of response."
What a fantastic
And I
story.
told him, I walked up, looked in the windows, and I saw the murals. And I said, "It's just gorgeous. And I just have to have it if you'll work with me and sell me the building."
That's fantastic. Let's take a quick break, get in another word from our sponsor, and we'll be right back. GearTrain is a national testing, inspection, and audit company that works in the e-commerce fulfillment industry. So these guys provide the quarterly and annual inspections, preventive maintenance inspections, and they do testing and audits of conveyor systems and automated equipment in big distribution facilities. They support the entrepreneur's journey, and we're proud to have them as a sponsor. You can find Gear Train online at geartrainperforms.com. And we are back with Darryl Smith, CEO of SPM out of Hammond, Louisiana. So, Darryl, I'm curious, you fall in love with this building, this 18-story building that reminds you of a beautiful woman. And you make an immediate offer. And so I'm curious, like, how did you value that? How did you come up with an offer that quick?
I didn't initially offer a price. I wanted to talk to the owner initially. And I offered more than I ended up paying for the building. But when I spoke to Arthur on that phone call, and he agreed to work exclusively with me, I told him, I said, look, I'll be in New York, and give me 7 to 10 days, and I'll be there. So within a week, I was in New York, having Robert came with me, and Robert, my son, and I went to New York, met with Arthur, and he has his office, Carnegie Hall Towers, I believe is the name of the office place. And charming, wonderful gentleman in person as well as on the phone. We have lunch at a little Italian restaurant 2 or 3 blocks down the street from his office tower, where his office is. And we go over the terms. We agreed on a lesser amount. I had my pros and my cons, and he finally gave in to that and shook hands on it. And a week later, I gave him a written contract. He signed it, and we went to closing. The building was 40% full when I bought it September of 17, and we're 100% full today.
Yeah.
So it was a lot of fun. Spent a lot of time there learning the engine room and streamlining. Spent several $100,000, but it's all paid off.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
The price, Andrew, I can't remember how I came up with the price, but it was based on his numbers, which were high. He had a lot of vacancies, but a lot of operating expenses, and that helped me drive the purchase price down.
Well, I know it's been a great property for you, and congrats on.
But one thing is that I bought that for $23 a foot, and you couldn't build it today for less than $50 million.
Yeah.
So when I look at an asset, and whatever it is, what do I have to do to make that asset sing?
Yeah.
And a lot of times you just have to take a different approach to it. And that's what I did with the Waterman.
That's a fascinating building. I mean, so speaking of fascinating buildings, your office, headquartered in Hammond, is a fantastic building. Tell us that story. How did you get that?
Well, I tried to buy that building several years prior to 2010. Evidently, I bought it in 2010 or 2009. I think I bought it in 2009. And I'd been trying to buy it probably since 2006, 2007. And I couldn't get anywhere with it. And then
it's a bank. It's a very large 3-story, really, bank office building with drive-through bank operations.
Yeah. It was built in 1983 by Citizens National Bank.
Right.
The president was Phil Livingston, and his Phil Livingston and Mason Foster. Phil may have been the president of the bank, and Mason was number 2 or number 3 guy. Two fine gentlemen that I learned a lot from.
But you weren't able to buy it initially, but it was post.
It was, well,
2008.
08, the sky was falling.
Right.
And I reached out and I asked Phil if he would make a phone call and see if there was any movement in Regions headquarters to sell that building.
Regions Bank
out of Birmingham.
Right.
And he, about a week later, he got back with me and he says, Darryl, I wasn't able to make any headway for you. And I said, well, thank you so very much. And about a week went by and I got a phone call from some of the guys at Regions in Birmingham. Said, yeah, we'll sell you the building. I said, well, what price do you want? And they said, well, we're going to let you make an offer to us. I said, well, that's fine. Send me all the operating expenses and I'll put something together for you. And he said, well, no, it's going to be contingent on you putting your own numbers together. We will not share any operating expenses with you at all. And which is, I've never had a deal like that before. So I put some numbers together and guesstimated on what I thought it would take. And to my amazement, we both agreed on a price and I acquired the building.
And then they continued to lease.
Yes.
They leased back from you. So it was a sale lease back, right?
Yes. It was, they had a 10-year lease agreement and it was, I've been very blessed. I've had a few home runs in my career, and that was one of them.
So they continued to operate on the first floor, and then you relocated your operations to the second floor. And it's just a fantastic building.
Yeah,
just
beautiful building, one whole city block in downtown Hammond.
Yeah, fantastic building.
And 44,000 square feet, a beautiful building.
So, Darryl, one thing I do know about you is that you're just a family man and a great father. And I think that's something that we share in common. I think we share quite a bit in common, and that's why we have such great conversations that we can go talking for hours as we're driving down the road, seemingly. But I wanted to see if you could summarize your business philosophy that you've learned through these decades of having built such an amazing empire, and the things that you pass on to your sons. You've talked about that a lot over the years, how one day they'll be there to run the business. So can you kind of boil that down? What you look at as being your guiding business philosophies?
Well, I go back to the early years where I grew up in the country, in Bush, and my mother came from a family of 6 or 5, no 7, and so I grew up watching all what I call a cast of characters in my family, aunts, uncles, and all the excitement, the happy, the friction, the joy, the fights, all that stuff. And that, I would say, prepared me. And I grew up watching, being the youngest grandson of 16 or 17, I believe, 15 plus grandkids. So I watched all these personalities grow up. And then on top of that, I had aunts and uncles. And then you throw in 100 rent houses and cattle and pecan and a restaurant, Triple Arch. And so it was like a gumbo of knowledge and expectations and interpretations. So that, I would have to say, prepared me to anticipate what was going to happen before it happened. And I've been, I say this all the time, I've been very blessed to anticipate things before they take place.
Well, I think and I think this is one of the things that you and I enjoyed talking about, is you're a student of the economy.
Yes.
And you look at, happenings in the markets and then predicting the impact that those may have on the local market or on your business in particular. And we've shared some great conversations about that. So, being predictive and analytical is a great gift to survival in business, right?
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, another question I had for you was the role of mentors in your life or in your business life, and I don't know that I know the answer to this one.
Well, as the decades go on in your life, you can pick certain people in different age brackets of your life that influenced you, and of course, I go back to the early years of living in the country. It was profound. It set the stage for me on, and I can remember as a kid. Of course, we lived in a little 2-bedroom, 1-bath cinder block house on 3,000 acres. And one day I climb on top of the old dog house with a tin roof, and I'm looking in my backyard and I see 1,000 acres of cotton. And it's like a fresh air just filled my lungs. And I said, this is what I want. And from that point, whether I was 6, 7, 8 years old, I knew what I wanted in life. And it was at that precise moment that I had a vision and a diversification
and ownership.
And I paid my dues. I made my sacrifices. When other people were driving in new cars, I was driving an old car, 5 years old, 7 years old. So I always used resources to make more resources. I didn't consume those resources.
But I think it's fair to say that you've also lived very modestly. I mean, which is what you're saying. But as I look at, you and I have talked over the years, like the homes that you have built and lived in for your family are very modest and,
yes.
and very, very nice and very beautiful homes. But you could live in any home that you choose to live in.
Thank you.
I sense that that ties back how you live your life clearly to the theme that's come up in this podcast, is how you were raised initially, and so that's kind of a cool thing. So, but any particular mentors that you want to call out?
Well, I'll touch on, of course, my mother. My mother always said one thing: people always need a place to live, so invest in multifamily housing. The other aspect was, I believe, athletics play a vital role in everyone's life. They should, and all students should play a form of athletics. I don't care if it's volleyball, football, baseball. Whatever it is, it's competition and it's good for you. From that point, my few names, John Beam has played another major role for me in my teens, coaches. When I got to him, and I'd say the Gewalt family was spectacular to me. And then my father was just a wonderful man with a lot of good common sense. And he'd always say, well, son, you've got enough to say grace over, so why don't you stop? And I'd say, well, Dad, I will soon, but not today. I'm going to keep on going. And so it's just a lot of people that I admire along the way, but I was always trying, and I always would pick up a few great things that I saw from other men and women. And I said, I like that idea. I'm going to incorporate that into what I do and how I live.
Yeah. I think it's when you mentioned the Gewalts and you bought that initial multifamily deal to them, and which they were experts in that business. They knew the value that was there. And they said, they pushed that back to you and said, no, you need to go do this. I mean, that was a pretty nice nice thing for them to do when they easily could have gobbled that up and pushed that initial gain onto their side of the table. So that, but I think that must have spoke a lot for how they saw you work in those 7 years prior, right?
Right.
So,
well, prior to '87, I had worked for them for 2 years, and after I acquired the Brent Apartments, I continued to work for them, managing my apartments,
That's
working for them, and still scouting. And until my operation grew so big, I couldn't. I had to resign from there, working for them and helping them in other areas.
Right. Well, Darryl, I got to tell you, I always love talking with you, and you know that.
Yes, sir.
And thank you for sharing your stories with us. And I know that your entrepreneurial drive runs deep, and you've built a tremendous business, and I know you're excited about the future as your children come of age to join you and ultimately take over the helm of that ship. But thank you so much for sharing and joining us today.
Thank you, sir, very much.
It's really fascinating to have watched Darryl throughout the years. He probably has the most concise business plan of anyone that I've seen in the real estate business or in the multifamily business. Very market specific. Initially, for the first maybe 10 or so years, it seems like, and then he strategically grew from there. But I've always enjoyed my conversations with Darryl. He's a fantastic family man, as I mentioned on the show, and I love hearing his conversations, how he is planning his business for the next generation. And it's just a great thing to watch. So we wish Darryl continued success. Thank you for listening to the Next Entrepreneur podcast. We'd like to thank our title sponsor, Mainspring Companies. It can be reached online at mainspringcompanies.com. If you have any questions or comments, you can reach us at ask@nxtentrepreneur.com. You can subscribe to the Next Entrepreneur podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Stitcher, or iHeartRadio. You can help support our podcasts by leaving a review on Apple Music. You can follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please share this episode with your family and friends. The Next Entrepreneur is produced by Propel Productions. They can be reached at propelyourstory.com. Today's episode was produced by Daniel Sagona.